key message 3 of the Southeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment. And my name is Aransasu Laskarain, and I am the Assistant University Director here at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are focusing on one key message per month, ending with the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter in January. But I will add that we have just added also for February an overview of the Caribbean chapter, which is a new chapter of the National Climate Assessment. So we look forward to having Bill Gould of the USDA join us for that in February. We wanted you all to hear directly from each of the key message lead authors with the opportunity to have a Q&A with them at the end of their presentation. And please keep in mind that we also want to make sure that the audience knows how to use all the components and data within each of the key messages. So if you will join me, we have a quick poll. Thank you for participating in this quick poll just to let us know how best to continue disseminating the National Climate Assessment material, but also to know who you are and the type of field in which you work in management. So we'll give everybody just a little minute or so to click on the poll, and that will also help us be able to cater future presentations. Okay, thank you so much for filling that out. That's really helpful. Thank you. Looks like we've got a little bit of everything here. We've got state agencies, federal tribal professionals and tribal citizens, a little bit of federal agencies, universities, and community members. So that's extremely helpful to us. And also interesting to note that quite a few people have never used the information from the report yet. So that's also helpful for us to know. All right, well, let me introduce you to Mike Osland, our presenter today. Dr. Mike Osland is a research ecologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's Wetland and Aquatic Research Center. In broad terms, his research examines the response of ecosystem to changing conditions, including the implications for conservation and restoration. And much of his current research focuses on wetland ecosystems at the dynamic interface between land and ocean, mangrove forests, salt marshes, and salt flats. His education includes a PhD in ecology from Duke University, a BA from Willamette University, and he was also a Fulbright Fellow in Costa Rica and a Peace Corps volunteer in El Salvador. So thank you very much, Mike. And we'll save a Q&A after your presentation.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. And if
if
anyone has any problems, just send us a quick chat.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. So again, my name is Michael Osland. I'm a research ecologist at the USGS based in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I'm going to be talking about a specific key message within the Southeast Regional Chapter. That's key message 3. And the focus is on natural ecosystems. Oops. Okay, so before I begin with the focus on that key message, I want to provide a bigger picture of where that key message and also where the regional chapter fits within the larger National Climate Assessment. So all of this is part of the 4th National Climate Assessment. The acronym for that is NCA4. And there are 2 reports, 2 volumes associated with. The first is the Climate Science Special Report, which was published in 2017. And that's the first volume. The second volume is focused on impacts, risks, and adaptation and was published in 2018. So the Southeast Regional Chapter is within this second volume. And I want to quickly talk about the CSSR. That's the acronym for the Climate Science Special Report, because it contains lots of useful information and lots of useful figures. And so within that volume 1, there are 15 chapters. The chapter topics range from temperature changes, precipitation changes, droughts, floods, wildfires, extreme storms, changes in land cover, sea level rise, ocean acidification. So each chapter covers a different topic, and there are many useful figures and tables and photos within these chapters, as well as lots of extremely relevant text for the expected changes in climate that will affect natural resources and ecosystems in the Southeast. So now the second volume focuses on impacts, risks, and adaptation, and this was published just about a year ago in 2018. And this volume has 29 chapters. The first chapter is an overview, and then there are these national topics. There are 17 chapters focused on different topics, and some of these, as you can see, address ecosystem impacts. So there's a chapter on land cover and land use change, a chapter on water, a chapter on forests. Chapter 7 is an ecosystems chapter. So the title for that one is Ecosystems, Ecosystem Services, and Biodiversity. Chapter 8 is a coastal effects chapter. Chapter 9 focuses on oceans and marine resources. So there's lots of relevant information within these chapters. And I'm going to actually, in my presentation, I've selected a few figures from some of these chapters, as well as from the CSSR. And so those national chapters are followed by 10 regional chapters, and these are the 10 different regions. So the Southeast chapter is chapter 19. And if you just search for National Climate Assessment, you'll be directed immediately to this. You can download the report, but you can also view it online and download specific figures. So this is the Southeast boundary. These are the different regions, 10 different regions across the country. The Southeast includes all those states that are in yellow. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. And then the last two chapters of that second volume focus on adaptation, and then the last one is on emissions mitigation. Okay, so before I begin, I want to acknowledge all the people that were involved in the Southeast chapter. Our federal coordinating lead author was Adam Tarando, who's based at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Our chapter lead was Lynn Carter. And then the chapter authors were Kristen Dow, Kevin Hires, Ken Kunkel, Aranzazu Lasgreen, Doug Marcy, Michael Osland, and Paul Schramm. And then we also had a review editor, Alessandra Drollerman, and then these technical contributors, Vincent Brown, Barry Kime, Julie Maldonado, Colin Posky, and April Taylor. And perhaps even more importantly, all of these efforts were coordinated by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And in particular, Lisa Listig played a really important role in coordinating the efforts of each of these individuals. And so the Southeast chapter has 4 key messages. As part of this webinar series, there's already been a webinar on the first key message, which focuses on urban infrastructure and health risks, as well as a webinar on the second key message, which focuses on increase in flood risks in coastal and low-lying regions. And so I'm going to be talking about the third key message, which is focused on natural ecosystems. And then the fourth key message is focused on the economic and health risks for rural communities. Okay, so here's the text. This is the text associated with that third key message on ecosystems, and I'm going to read it. The message is: the Southeast's diverse natural systems, which provide many benefits to society, will be transformed by climate change. Change in winter temperature extremes, wildfire patterns, sea levels, hurricanes, floods, drought, and warming ocean temperatures are expected to redistribute species and greatly modify ecosystems. As a result, the ecological resources that people depend on for livelihood, protection, and well-being are increasingly at risk, and future generations can expect to experience and interact with natural systems that are much different than those that we see today. And here is a figure from the ecosystems chapter of the National Climate Assessment that illustrates the link in a real broad sense between climate change, the non-climate stressors, and biodiversity, terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, those ecosystem services that the ecosystems provide, in other words, those societal benefits, and their effects on human well-being. And so this is a nice slide that summarizes in a real broad sense the key message for this section as well, that ecosystems will be transformed by climate change, which will have an effect on ecosystem services and also an impact on human well-being. And so within this key message, there are different subsections, and each of the subsections are fairly short. You know, this is just one small component of this chapter. But there's a section on warm and winter temperature extremes, a section on change in patterns of fire, a section on rise in sea levels and hurricanes, a section on drought and extreme rainfall, and then the last section within this key message is on warm and ocean temperatures. And so I'm going to go through these individually, starting off with warm and winter temperature extremes. And so the Southeast spans a fairly large climatic gradient that ranges from tropical and subtropical all the way to temperate. So in the South in Florida, we have tropical and subtropical species, and as you move northward, freeze events begin to play a less important role, and ecosystems transition to more temperate ecosystems. So here's a real simple schematic of that. In the South, we have tropical and subtropical species and ecosystems. These species and ecosystems are freeze sensitive, and in many ways, it's those extreme events that control the northward range limit and extension of those species or ecosystems, and they transition into more freeze tolerant species and ecosystems as you move north across this region. And so that's really important because in the future we're expecting to see warmer winter temperatures and a decrease in the frequency and intensity of these extreme winter events, freeze events and chilling events. And so I've included a couple of figures to illustrate this concept. And here's a picture of there's an orange tree under that tarp. And this is a fairly common sight across much of the Gulf in that transition zone between tropical and temperate. And so most of our winters are warm enough to support a fairly large orange tree. But every now and then, once every decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, there's a freeze event that can result in damage or mortality to that orange tree. And here, this homeowner has actually tried to protect this orange tree and trap all that soil, the warm temperatures from the soil, to minimize freeze damage. Now, for natural systems, here is a photo of a black mangrove, Avicennia germinans, near its northern range limit. This is a photo from Louisiana. And so here a similar process has taken place in a natural ecosystem, in that this plant has moved north. It's had several years of warm winters for it to grow, and then a freeze event caused this leaf damage. And it's those freeze events that control the northern range limit of mangroves. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a second. But before I do, I want to show this slide. This is actually a figure from our chapter. This is figure 19.15. And all of these figures can be downloaded as a zip file and extracted. And so you don't have to go into the PDF and take a snapshot or anything like that. You can actually go to the National Climate Assessment website and download all of the figures for each chapter together as a zipped file, and then extract them and use them in your own presentations. And so this is one that's particularly good from our key message in the Southeast chapter. And it focuses on these plant hardiness zones, and most people are familiar with these. These are USDA plant hardiness zones, and they're often used by gardeners and farmers to decide what plants may survive in a given area. And that indice, that metric, reflects the annual average lowest minimum temperature, which is on the bottom of that legend, and it ranges from -15 to 50. So for example, one area that I typically key on is just north of Tampa, and it's the orange. I'll put my cursor over there. Hopefully you can see it. I'm over zone 9A at the moment. And as you look into the future, there's a future projection there for a higher emission scenario, the RCP 8.5 for the end of the century. And what the future figure shows is the extension of that zone. So if you key in on one of those zones like 9A, you see that under the historical scenario, it's restricted primarily to Florida and a small part of Louisiana. But in the future, under this projection, it spans into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and even parts of coastal North Carolina, as well as Louisiana. And so this has big implications for plants, but it also has big implications for all sorts of other organisms as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that here. And so scientists sometimes refer to this process as tropicalization. So it's the northward movement of these tropical species. And if they outcompete temperate organisms, it would result in the tropicalization of temperate ecosystems. And so here's a figure that includes a range of species that are controlled by freeze events. And so they include the mangroves, as well as the invasive Brazilian pepper tree, which is a problematic plant in Florida that's expected to move northward. Melaleuca, old world climbing fern. There's a photo of the Burmese python, which I'll talk more about in a second, but that's a problematic snake in South Florida that's eaten 80% of the mammals and is controlled by these freeze events. And so there's the potential for it to move northward in the future. There's photos of different reptiles, iguanas. There's a photo of the Cuban tree frog, which is spread into Louisiana now, as well as several recreational fish. Snook is a species that is especially sensitive to cold spells and freeze events, and so its northward range limit is controlled by these freeze events. And so there's lots of different examples, sea turtles as well, and ducks. Duck migration is controlled by these winter temperatures. So there's a lot of different species that would be expected to move northward in response to warm and winters, as long as they're able to disperse into those new climates. And so I'm going to talk real briefly about mangroves. So winter climate, these freeze events control mangrove marsh interactions in the southeast. And so here's a map that shows the northern range limit of mangrove forests in Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. And so warm and winters are expected to lead to the northward migration of mangroves, and their temperate counterpart are salt marshes. So salt marsh plants are more freeze tolerant. And as mangroves move northward, they're expected to become established in salt marshes and outcompete salt marshes, and eventually replace salt marshes. And here's a photo that's actually in our chapter. So this is figure 19.17, and it's a photo of a marsh and a mangrove forest. That mangrove forest is from Everglades National Park. And then there's this figure, which is figure 19.16, which actually quantifies that tip-in point. So this is the temperature zone where salt marshes are replaced by mangrove forests, and it occurs around -7 degrees Celsius. The x-axis here is in Fahrenheit, and the y-axis is coastal wetlands dominated by mangrove forests from 0 to 100. So that where at 0, those wetlands are dominated by salt marshes, and this illustrates that there's a really dramatic threshold or tipping point that controls that transition. And we can use that to identify areas where salt marshes are especially sensitive to mangrove forest expansion and replacement. And those are salt marshes in Texas, Louisiana, and then these parts of Florida circled by these ovals. Okay, so the other organisms highlighted in this subsection include other plants. And so the section includes a brief mention of citrus, and then mangroves, of course. And then it includes a mention of insects, for example, mosquitoes and tree damage and beetles. Birds are used as a real brief example, especially within the context of duck migration. And then tropical coastal recreational fish, especially snook. And then the problematic invasive non-native species are especially important because these are species that have been introduced, have transformed ecosystems in Florida, namely the Brazilian pepper tree and the Burmese python. And given the effects that they've had on native ecosystems in Florida, the risk is very high that the northward range expansion of these species would also impact native ecosystems beyond their current range limit. And so here's a photo it's figure 19.18 in our chapter. And it's a photo of some USGS scientists actually at our center, the Wetland and Aquatic Research Center, holding a very large Burmese python. And I assume that this photo is from Everglades National Park. Okay, so that was the first subsection, the section on warm and winter temperature extremes. And the next subsection that I'm going to focus on is the changing patterns of fire. And Kevin Heyer is one of the co-authors on this chapter, who's at Tall Timbers, is a fire expert. And so he played a very important role in this section. And so the main themes are first, that fire plays a very important ecological role in the region. Historically, fires played a very, very important role in the Southeast. While the Southeast doesn't have let me rephrase that. While the total area burned by wildfire is largest in the western United States, the Southeast actually has the largest area burned by prescribed fire, as well as the highest number of wildfires. So fire still plays a very, very important role in the region. And in the future, rise in temperatures and changes in drought duration and intensity are expected to increase wildfire occurrence and reduce the effectiveness of prescribed fire. And urban expansion can also limit the potential effectiveness of prescribed fire as well. And so there are some really good figures in our chapter focused on fire. Here's one. This is figure 19.19, and the photo on the top was provided by Kevin. And the figure on the bottom is adapted from Addington et al. 2015. And the photo on the top is a helicopter fighting a wildfire at Herbert Field and Eglin Air Force Base in Northwest Florida. And then the figure on the bottom includes data from Fort Benning, Georgia. And along the x-axis are years, and then on the two y-axes, we have number of wildfires in red, and then the prescribed fire in orange. And what this figure shows is it nicely shows the relationship between an increase in prescribed fire, which produces a decrease in the number of wildfires. Okay, so that is the section on fire, and there's a lot more information in other chapters, as well as other key messages within our chapter on fire. But now I'm going to be moving on to rise in sea levels and hurricanes, and this is an especially important subsection for the Southeast. The southeastern coast is very, very flat, and so the effects of sea level rise and hurricanes are very large. They've always been very, very large, and they're expected to increase in the future. And so here is a figure from the sea level rise chapter of the Climate Science Special Report. And this is an especially important chapter for our region because of the sea level rise effects. So for anyone that's interested in learning more about sea level rise effects in the region, this is a really good chapter. And I'd also like to direct them to the source for a lot of the information contained within that chapter, which is this interagency report by Billy Sweet and others, produced in 2017. The title is Global and Regional Sea Level Rise Scenarios for the United States. So what this figure shows different sea level rise scenarios through 2100. They range from low to extreme. And then on the right, we have the three different emission scenarios, the 2.6, the 4.5, and 8.5, and their relation to those sea level rise scenarios. And here's a figure from our chapter. This is actually from Key Message 2. So Key Message 2 focuses on sea level rise and tidal flooding, especially to human communities. And so this is a figure that shows the annual number of high tide flood-in days in Fort Pulaski, Georgia. And on the y-axis, we have the number of days per year. And along the y-axis, the black bars are observations. The gray bar is the trend line. And then the blue and the red are reflective of three different sea level rise scenarios: an intermediate low, an intermediate scenario, and an extreme scenario. And this just shows the dramatic change in the number of days of high tide flooding throughout the next century associated with these different scenarios. And so this figure is tremendously important for coastal human communities, but it's also incredibly important for ecosystems. So with sea level rise, you have an increase in inundation, an increase in the salinity in these ecosystems. And so those salts and the inundation have the potential to convert and transform upland and freshwater ecosystems to more saltwater adapted species and ecosystems. So many freshwater and upland ecosystems are expected to transition to tidal saline ecosystems. And then with the higher rates of sea level rise, there's actually the potential for wetland loss. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But before I do, here's another figure from that climate science special report. So in addition to these global changes in sea level, there are these local processes that are also important. And in our region, subsidence is very, very important. And so this figure shows the projected relative sea level change for 2100 under the intermediate scenario. And the change in sea level ranges from 0 to greater than 6 feet. And if you look at the area near Louisiana and Texas, you see that it's in red and orange. And that high rate of relative sea level change is due to high rates of subsidence. And there's also a big orange section along the Atlantic coast as well. And so those are areas where the rate of relative sea level rise is very, very high. And in Louisiana, that high rate of relative sea level rise is a big deal because it can result in land loss. And Louisiana, in many ways, is the poster child for the effects of high rates of sea level rise. This is a map, and I know this map is very hard to see, but I wanted to include it in its entirety because it includes an incredible amount of information. It was produced by Brady Couvion, who's a scientist at our center, as well as other scientists at our center as well. And what it illustrates is the change in land area in coastal Louisiana from 1932 to 2016. And those colors illustrate land change. And so there's an area in green and yellow, a small area in green and yellow near the Wax Lake and Atchafalaya Delta. Those are areas where there's a small amount of land building. But if you focus on the reds, those are areas of land loss. And what's especially nice about this map is you can attribute the land loss to a specific time period. And so since 1932, Louisiana's lost 2,006 square miles of land, and the rate is variable, but it's roughly a football field of land every 34 to 100 minutes. And so here's a zoomed in section. It's a little blurry, but you can see if you zoom into the map, you really can identify specific areas, and each of those colors refers either to land loss or land gain in a specific period in time. So there's a tremendous amount of information in these maps. They're incredibly useful, but in many ways, Louisiana is a poster child for the effects of sea level rise on coastal wetlands. So coastal wetlands have the potential to migrate vertically in response to sea level rise. So there's positive feedbacks between inundation, plant growth, and sedimentation, that under moderate rates of sea level rise, wetlands can actually build and build land in place to keep up with sea level rise. But under the higher rates, there's the potential for them to be converted to open water. Now, coastal wetlands can adapt to sea level rise using another mechanism as well, and that's this landward migration or transgression. And so in this figure, there is this space for horizontal migration where marshes or mangrove forests are moving landward at the expense of upland or freshwater forests or freshwater marsh or upland grasslands. And so this is something that we expect to occur across the entire Southeast, but especially in areas that have a low-lying coast. Now, where there's a barrier to that migration, let's say development or a levee or even natural topography, there's very little space for horizontal migration. And those are areas where if there's wetland loss and there's no room for those wetlands to grow, we expect to see something that's called coastal squeeze. And so, again, where there's high slope, there's not much area for migration. Where there's low slope, there's lots of room for horizontal migration. And so I want to quickly highlight a product that quantified this for the Gulf of Mexico. It doesn't include the Atlantic coast of the US, but includes for our Southeast region, the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Gulf Coast of Florida. And it nicely illustrates the potential for wetland landward migration. So the areas in dark blue, those are areas that are extremely flat, where wetlands are expected to move landward. And there's a lot of area of land that would be affected by this landward migration. So those are upland systems, freshwater systems that would be converted to tidal saline systems. And so the ecological implications of that are very, very large. And so some hotspots of that migration are South Florida, Louisiana, of course, and then parts of Texas. And within this paper, the lead authors there's two papers focused on this topic. One was produced by Shane Borchert in 2018, and then the second is Nicholas Enright in 2016. And the second question was, where are there urban barriers where coastal squeeze might occur? And so this figure really highlights the highly urbanized estuaries in Florida, Tampa Bay, for example, where there's very little room for wetlands to migrate in response to sea level rise. And so that's an estuary where if wetlands aren't able to keep pace with sea level rise, coastal squeeze and wetland loss would be expected to occur. But there's other hotspots in addition to Florida. So there's parts of Louisiana where there are barriers, and then the Galveston Bay as well. So, okay, so sea level rise is going to have a very, very large role on ecosystems across the coastal parts of the Southeast. Hurricanes, we know they play a really important role, have historically played a really important role in the Southeast. Here's a map of the global hurricane tracks. Those reds and yellows correspond to the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale categories, 1 to 5. And as you can see, while there's many coastlines across the world that aren't affected by hurricanes, we happen to live in an area where hurricanes play a major role. And so here is some text regarding hurricanes from the Climate Science Special Report, Chapter 9. And I've underlined some key sections. So increase in tropical cyclone intensity, increase in the number of very intense tropical cyclones. So in other parts of the world, tropical cyclones, hurricanes are tropical cyclones. So there's different names for tropical cyclones in different parts of the world. In our region, we happen to call them hurricanes. But at the global level, they're called tropical cyclones. Increases are projected in precipitation rates and intensity, and that's especially important. Recently, we've seen some very high precipitation events in our region. Hurricane Harvey is an excellent example. In Louisiana, we had some major precipitation events in 2016, which resulted in lots of flooding in the town that I live in, Lafayette, and also in Baton Rouge. And then the last underlined section is the frequency of the most intense of these storms is projected to increase in the Atlantic. And so Here's a figure from the CSSR. This is from Chapter 9, Extreme Storms. It's figure 9.2. On the top, we have the number of Category 4 and 5 storms under a present-day simulation. And on the bottom, we have the number of those 4 and 5 storms under a 4.5 emission scenario for the late 21st century. And you can see the number is higher, 244 versus 313. And okay, so that's it for that section. Now, this middle section, rise in sea levels and hurricanes, is perhaps one of the most important aspects of climate change in our region because of our low-lying coast and the amount of human communities along those coasts, as well as the effects on natural systems. And so this middle section, I didn't really talk too much about it, but rise in sea levels and changes in hurricane intensity are some of the aspects of climate change that will have the largest effect in our region. Okay, the next subsection is drought and extreme rainfall. And these last two subsections are fairly short. The texts aren't very long. But in terms of drought and extreme rainfall, climate change is expected to intensify the hydrologic cycle and increase the frequency and severity of extreme events like drought and heavy rainfall. And so the effects that are highlighted include drought-induced dieback of foundation plant species. So foundation plants provide, well, the foundation. They really create ecosystems, and some ecosystems are very dependent on foundation plant species. And so the dieback is very significant. Other highlighted effects are the effects on the hydroperiods, the hydrologic regimes of aquatic and wetland ecosystems, and then extreme rainfall effects on flooding regimes. And there's a nice figure that illustrates a specific extreme rainfall event that occurred in 2015 in South Carolina. And this is from the second key message of our chapter. And it's figure 19.12. And those colors correspond to the maximum 4-day precipitation, which peaks at 26.88. And so this is an event that produced a lot of rain. And we've had a lot of similar events across the region, like those that I mentioned in Texas, Hurricane Harvey, Tropical Storm Imelda. In Louisiana, we've had several events like this over the past several years. And so that's one of the expectations with climate change, is we'll see more of these events that bring a lot of rainfall. And so here's a photo associated with that event. This is figure 19.13, and it's a figure of a flooded neighborhood in South Carolina. And so the ecological impacts of these floods are large because the inundation produces anaerobic conditions, which can result in mortality of plants and results in movement of fish and wildlife. Okay, the last section is on warming ocean temperatures. And so the conclusions here, this is a short section, are that many marine and coastal species are sensitive to small changes in ocean temperature. The distribution and abundance of marine organisms are expected to be greatly altered by warming ocean temperatures. And this topic is covered in more detail in Chapter 9, specifically within the context of coral reef loss, and also the effects on marine fisheries. And so here are I've included a couple figures from other portions of the National Climate Assessment. This is a figure from the ecosystems chapter. So this is figure 7.4, and the upper panels A, B, and C. A just shows the area where B and C highlight, so that's the box. And then B and C show the expected change in range of lionfish. So lionfish is an invasive species that's problematic. And these maps show the change in range. For the future, it's under the RCP 8.5 emission scenario for different years, 1987 to 2006, and then 2041 to 2060, and then 2081 to 2100. And you can see that range is expected to expand northward and closer to the coasts. So here's another figure. This one's from the Oceans and Marine Resources chapter. This is figure 9.3, and it was produced by the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And this figure highlights the effects of different extreme Mormon events. And so in our region in the Southeast, the focus is on coral and coral reef loss. But there's other events across the country as well that are highlighted by those different colors. And if you're interested in learning more, you can have a look at that Oceans and Marine Resources chapter. And that chapter also includes this map of projected changes in maximum fish catch. And so this is figure 9.2, and the colors, the reds and oranges, correspond to a decrease in the percent of maximum catch potential, and the blues correspond to an increase. And so this just real broadly illustrates the effect of warming temperatures on fish. Okay, so that's it for the 5 subsections, and I want to end with this slide from the ecosystems chapter, just to bring it back to the effects on ecosystem services and human well-being. And I didn't really talk too much about specific ecosystem services, but terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems in our region provide many, many different ecosystem services. They range from fish and wildlife habitat to water quality improvements due to biogeochemical processes, to flood mitigation and coastal protection, to food and fiber, which support the economy. In Louisiana, seafood is especially important, for example. And so those ecosystem services are directly tied to our human well-being in the region, and climate change is expected to affect those ecosystems, which is going to affect some of those societal benefits and ecosystem services. And the ecosystems that we see today are expected to be different in the future. So future generations will see ecosystems that are different due to the effects of climate change. And so again, I want to quickly thank all of the authors and contributors and review editors for this chapter. And for especially in this section, Kevin Hires, who helped me with this natural resource section, and especially with the fire component, and also the US Global Change Research Program coordinators who played such an important role. And so if anybody has any questions, they can send me an email, and I think we also have some time for questions, but there's my email address. Thank you so much for joining the webinar.
Mike, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It was fantastic, and it was just sobering to understand sort of the complexities with ecosystems in the Southeast, given how diverse they are and so many different gradients. So we welcome anyone from folks on the line. It's a manageable group, so please unmute yourself. You have that ability now if you'd like to ask a question of Mike. And if you feel like you prefer, you can also type in a question via the chat box. And we can also, I think between Carrie and I, we can also prompt you some questions, Mike, as well, because several came to mind, but I'd like to just make sure if our audience has any questions to please go first.
Yeah, so feel free to weigh in again, and I'll just jump in. This is Carrie. So Mike, can you just describe what are like the processes by which hurricanes sort of directly affect ecosystems? I mean, is it primarily through the extreme rainfall, the change in the hydrologic regime? Is it the wind? I mean, are there some direct effects, or are they really, you know, do you see it in other aspects of
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really glossed over it. So the question was, how do hurricanes affect ecosystems? And so the effects are diverse. Hurricanes bring really strong winds. They can bring storm surge. They can bring heavy rainfall. And they can also deposit salt in areas that don't typically receive salt. And so the strong winds can actually knock down forests. That's a real tangible example. For example, in the Everglades, they can rip leaves off of forests if it's a minor hurricane. But if it's an extreme hurricane, they can actually knock down forests and potentially kill forests. Now, in terms of storm surge, so the storm surge has a very, very large effect in that you've got this oceanic wave of water that pushes inland. And in many cases, it can bring salt, and that salt has a big effect on freshwater and upland ecosystems because it's a stress that they can't really tolerate. And so you've got salt, you've got the inundation due to storm surge, you've got the very, very strong winds, and then some hurricanes will actually bring a lot of rainfall, which may produce high rates of sedimentation and prolonged flooding, which can produce anaerobic conditions. And so the effects are really diverse, and it really depends on the hurricane and where it has its impact. Now, I work in coastal wetlands. Coastal wetlands happen to be particularly resistant to hurricanes, and so they've been affected by hurricanes, especially mangrove forests in our region for a long, long time, and they're able to recover fairly quickly. But the effects of hurricanes are most dramatic on those freshwater and upland systems that can't tolerate that salt, that inundation. They're not as used to it. And so that's a great question, Carrie. And the effects are really diverse. They're dependent upon the track of the hurricane and the intensity as well, and the ecosystem that's affected.
Yeah, thanks.
Mike, so I would imagine just the complexities of ecosystems, and I think Carrie brought up just hurricanes alone has numerous ways to affect ecosystems, and there's also these compounding effects, you know, on ecosystems with all these various subsections you went through. So, I mean, is it, you know, I would imagine just there's an inordinate amount of research still to understand all of this. And so, you know, and I know that you specifically focus on mangrove migration. And so do we still need to understand a lot of these, you know, specific species effects from climate change? Or what can you tell us about some of the science needs?
Yeah, so so Aranzaza, you brought up the complexities, and you're right. There's so many different aspects of climate change that affect ecosystems, and typically scientists study on one or two aspects, but not necessarily the interactions between many aspects. So, for example, with coastal wetlands, sea level rise is the most important aspect of climate change. And so most studies will focus just on sea level rise without studying the interactions between all the different drivers. And so, yeah, I would say that there's a very strong need for research efforts that focus on the interactions between multiple aspects of climate change. Yeah, and so I think the second part of your question, are there species-specific effects? Yes, there's a need for that type of research as well.
Well, thank you, Mike. And if I could just squeeze in one more, there was a map you showed of the Gulf region that is more sensitive, or the salt marshes in those areas are more sensitive, I think, to sea level rise than others. And like, for example, if you looked at the strip of coastal Mississippi, it wasn't red the way it was in Louisiana and eastern Texas. So I was just curious why that might be.
That's a great question. And so I think you're referring to the map of potential landward migration. And so that map shows the amount of land that is expected to be affected by sea level rise within the context of coastal wetlands moving landward and replacing upland and freshwater ecosystems. And so it highlights parts of the coast where there's a lot of potential. So like Louisiana and South Florida, but that doesn't necessarily mean that landward migration won't play an important role in other states like Mississippi, Alabama, and those other parts of Florida. Those are areas that are also flat. They're just not as flat as Louisiana and Florida.
Okay, okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, please, if anyone has any other questions, please don't hesitate. We've got a few more minutes.
Greg Wathen.
Oh, Greg. Okay, Greg, wonderful.
Okay, Greg, you should be unmuted if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Mike, this is Greg Wathen. How you doing?
Hey, Greg. Good to hear from you.
Yeah. Hey, good presentation. I just wanted to get your sense of, I'm reading a lot about, it seems that sea level rise and ocean effects from climate change are accelerating perhaps faster than we thought. What's your sense of that, and what keeps you up at night in terms of sea level rise and coastal impacts?
Oh. Well, first of all, I have 2 young kids, so I fall asleep really quickly. I'm usually tired at the end of the day.
Well, good for you. I'm glad you do.
Yeah, sea level rise. There's a lot more that we need to do to prepare for the effects of sea level rise, both within the natural resource community, but also within our coastal cities. And so I showed a slide of the sea level rise scenarios, and they range from low to high, and those high scenarios are extremely scary, and they should keep people up at night. And so there's just a tremendous amount that we can do from a city and regional planning perspective, but also from a natural resource planning perspective to better prepare for the effects of sea level rise, especially those higher scenarios, those, the intermediate high scenarios. And so it really depends upon risk. And so there's some aspects of that planning where, let's say you have a hospital or, a neighborhood that you really do not want to be inundated. And so those are situations where those planners should be planning for those higher scenarios. And then in the natural resource community, the risk isn't quite as high. And so some of those intermediate scenarios are more appropriate, but there's a lot more that we could and should be doing along the coastal parts of the Southeast.
Do you think we're trending towards the higher scenarios, or is it too early to tell, or what's your sense on that?
So within the sea level rise chapter, so Greg, I would refer you to the sea level rise chapter of the Climate Science Special Report. And within that, there are probabilities associated with each of the scenarios. And so there's a really nice table that has the probability for each of the different emission scenarios and links it back to those 6 scenarios. And I can follow up with you and send that to you. But that's a really good resource in terms of selecting scenarios.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks
Sure,
for the presentation.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah.
Good to hear from you, Greg.
You too.
Yeah, I wanted to just bring up a couple of slides for you, and back up what Mike said is, again, here are the URLs for both volume 1. What Mike has been referring to is this Climate Science Special Report, volume 2, known as the NCA4. The URLs are in yellow. And let me also, here is what you come to when you land at the webpage for the NCA4. And here the orange arrows just look at the report chapters is where you can find quickly either the regional chapters or the specific topic chapters. And then under downloads, you can quickly find those graphics that Mike referenced today, including all the other figures for all the other chapters. So I encourage everybody to consider maybe downloading some of these figures into your presentations or for grant applications. I know a lot of people are using them. So just wanted to point that out to you. And let me just, let me see. I wanted to show you one more slide. Here we go. And that is to tell you that our next key message is number 4, where we'll be discussing economic and health risks for rural communities with Kirsten Dow from the University of South Carolina. That's December 5th. And here is our website. If you want to find out more information about us, if you are not already on our newsletter, please consider joining and finding out more information of other webinars, other events, publications that we promote throughout the Southeast region. So with that, thank you very much to everybody for participating today, and especially to Mike Osland, who's a close collaborator and researcher with us here in the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And don't hesitate to reach out to myself and to Mike if you have any other questions. And also to let you know that we've recorded the session, so if you want to review some of the materials or share with your colleagues, we will be making a posting on our website shortly with that information. All right, well, thank you very much, and we will see you hopefully next month.